My name's Michael Haugh, and I'm here at the 18th International Pragmatics Association Conference in Brussels, Belgium, with Professor Stephen Levinson. And we thought it would be great to take the chance to talk to Steve about his life, about his work in pragmatics, such a senior leader in the field. So we wanted to hear from a founder of the field. So it's always good to start at the beginning, and thought perhaps it would be interesting just to hear a little bit about your childhood, Steve, and where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in London most of the time. My parents were doctors. They were Australians.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I have an Australian passport.
Oh, I didn't know.
And,
a secret Australian.
Yes, an Aussie.
Yes.
In disguise.
Okay.
And they, like a lot of Australians at that time, just after the war, they came for further training, and they just never went back, actually. So, and that's, right. I think, that particular generation of Australians, there were many talented people who went to the old world, as I sorry, to the homeland, for further training and so on. Anyway, yes, So my father was actually a psychiatrist. He'd got into psychiatry because of shell shock in the war and that sort of thing.
Wow.
And my mum was a hospital, a school doctor in deprived London schools. But we were very well off, really, compared to, I think, a lot of the sort of post-war generation. My father's father was owner of a department store in Perth. They were Perth people. And and so he was kind of there was enough money, so a comfortable middle class childhood. I went to boarding school. Because my father had all this kind of education. He was a child psychiatrist, so he had all these theories about how his children should brought up.
Okay.
So I went to a very kind of big, it wasn't experimental school, but in those days it was co-educational boarding school.
Okay.
Which with sort of arts and crafts kind of bias. It had a little farm, and we learned to make bread, and
wow.
And that's how I'm now sort of amateur sculptor, and I learned all those things.
Right.
So, and then I got a scholarship to Cambridge, and what I left out here is that I was a very keen amateur archaeologist. So every summer, as a kid, I'd go digging.
Okay.
Which you could do because they had volunteers. It was just they needed
people to dig in the ground.
Dig in the ground, and there were Roman sites in southern England and so on.
Did you find anything exciting on your trip?
Well, it was exciting, to me, just finding, I remember in very St Albans, finding, the remains of the amphitheatre there, and, but I no Tutankhamun's gold or anything. But, so then, in the year before going to university, I actually organised through friends of the family. I actually worked as an archaeologist in Libya. This is before Gaddafi. Gaddafi was just about to do his.
Yes,
and it was, and I worked in the Jebel Akhtar in Cyrenaica, and it was completely not unexplored, but underexplored. You could wander around, and because it's a very kind of curious world, because the Romans and the Greeks had been there, and they had all these fantastic. Cyrene was a fantastic site, for example, and you could just wander around and find all these ancient tombs, and because the Bedouin are not interested in building things, so all of that stuff never got reused, or the only problem was the Bedouin liked to grind down marble statues to make bread ovens, but apart from
that, they left furniture.
Those extraordinary things. So I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
And that was terminated by the Arab-Israeli war, and I got interned, and it was all kind of complicated. But anyway,
wow,
that was right. But it was very exciting. First by Libyans who sort of thought, we were on the wrong side, the Brits,
Okay.
and then I somehow got stuck in a kind of camp where actually the British Army, there was still bits of British Army there in Libya. I remember, it was very dramatic. We had this old fort that was like on the edges of Sahara, and we had this gun trained, cowards trained on the gates at the front in case they ran for us. Anyway.
Wow. Okay. That's pretty formative, right?
So yes, but it didn't put me off field work. I loved it actually. So. I learned a bit of Arabic and that kind of thing, but it's long gone, unfortunately.
But is that the connection then to languages? Because was it multicultural London, or was it? Where does that come from? For you, right?
Well, it's a long story, and I won't take too long to go through it all. But roughly the sequence was this: in Cambridge, I was studying Paleolithic archaeology, which is what it was strong in, and then I got into the hands of a very extraordinary archaeologist called Eric Higgs, who he sort of believed you should carry out experiments to see, for example, can you tame a muskox? Okay. So you'd have people, in the Arctic trying to tame muskox and to see whether it could. Well, and I remember him saying to me, "Stephen, just think of this, You can find a 1-ton pelvis of a mammoth deep inside a cave. How do you think it got there?
Well, true.
So anyway, he was anyway, but then I sort of got into ethnoarchaeology, which is the study of current people's use of materials and so on, in order to reconstruct the past. And then from there it was a very sort of easy road into social anthropology. Yeah, of course. And then I fell under the spell, really, of Edmund Leach, who was an anthropologist of renown, and who was very interested in communication. And he wrote a little book on communication that was very influential. Yes, we've all forgotten about these things, but he was a structuralist. He was so he was interested in the Levi-Straussian ideas of opposition, which of course turn up again in horn scales. But these ideas floating around, and so he encouraged me. He said, and I took linguistics as a sort of subsidiary
within anthropology.
And then he encouraged me to apply to the States, and so for postgraduate, because in Britain at the time linguistics was pretty primitive actually.
At Cambridge, right?
Cambridge, and I think elsewhere.
Just elsewhere,
Sort of Halliday in London, and there were other schools, but in terms of sort of modern generative kind of linguistics. John Lyons was the only really card-carrying, well, apart from Peter Søren, who actually taught me in Cambridge, who later turned out to be a colleague in the Netherlands, but very curious. Yeah, anyway, yes, years later, Peter Søren, 20, 30 years later, he would always remind me, on question 1 of your final exams, you said this. It was totally erroneous. Extraordinary man.
When he remembered, right?
Yes.
Gosh.
Anyway, so I had a choice of, I think it was Yale versus Berkeley versus Indiana. Okay. And I wanted to go somewhere more, the most different from Cambridge. So
California, right? Yes.
Berkeley attracted me. Yeah. So, and what luck, because at that time, now we're talking early 70s, right at the beginning of the 70s. Yeah. Berkeley had just had a confluence of the most extraordinary people. So we had Paul Grice there, we had John Searle there, we had Chuck Fillmore, we had Brent Berlin, Paul Kay, and John Gumpertz, and the Lakoffs, and on and on. Eleanor Roche. I mean,
wow.
If you think about it, it's extraordinary. It was just and there were lots of very interesting postdocs and so on as well, of whom Larry Horn was one.
Oh,
yeah.
So you were a PhD student. He was the
he was. I was looking up to him. He was very, very clever. Sure. Still is.
Of course.
And yes, Polly Jacobson. There were other very brilliant people. Anyway, so but I was still in an anthropological mode, and so I went to the Language Behaviour Research Lab, which was a little basement of a building. Where John Gumpertz, Paul Kay, and Brent Berlin, and Chuck Fillmore in particular sort of held sway.
Yes.
And that was a very congenial environment. Anyway, I was determined to do fieldwork in India, which so I went to learn Tamil, and I had to learn that. India is it's an ancient, complicated society. So sort of reading up on Indian sociology and so on. Yeah. It's quite an investment, really.
So how long were you in India with your fieldwork?
Altogether, not that long, maybe about a year, but in bits, yes.
Okay.
I got ill and, Delhi belly, and,
I didn't want to ask, but we all wanted to ask, right? Oh, gosh.
Yes, and that was, I have to say, I chose to work in the most old-fashioned corner of India then, which was, so I was in Dravidian India in the south, in Tamil Nadu, working in a little village called Olapalayam in Kongu Nadu, which is really was a sort of high arid plateau where you had to dig deep down to get any water, and then all of this was monopolized by one caste, the landowning caste, and then you had these many dependent castes, about 20 in the little village, and it was fascinating social organization. I mean, if you're you couldn't think of a more complicated world, really. Every one of those castes had their own kinship system with different marriage rules, different, some of them had different languages at home. They were all Dravidian, apart from the Brahmins, who actually used Sanskrit a bit.
Wow.
One of my teachers at Berkeley was a weird guy called Fritz Stahl, who was a Sanskritist, but he would whiz around South India on a motorbike. He didn't speak any Tamil, or according to him, he didn't. He would just go to the nearest Brahmins and speak Sanskrit, and it's actually a completely extraordinary world. It was then.
Yes.
Like I said, you could go into some village and there would be a Sanskrit school, and there you would see kids learning by rote the Rig Veda of, I'm not sure how many thousands of words, but 100,000. And that was, so that was what the school. Wow, extraordinary. And they didn't understand a word of it.
Wow. So literally just memorizing sounds, strings of sounds. Gosh.
Wow.
Anyway. So how many people in the village were, just to give us a sense of what it was
5,000, 6,000.
Okay, so
it's small,
like a
town, really.
Right?
But it's sort of spread out, and there were caste areas.
Okay.
It was all, and it was fascinating. You couldn't just go and sit on somebody's veranda unless you belonged to one of the castes that were allowed to do that.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually, you could map the entire social structure just by looking at pronominal use. How do you address so and so, and then so you had to do a sort of vous or vi pronoun upwards, and you'd get a tu or a t pronoun down, and then you could just look at who did what to whom, and you could reconstruct the entire hierarchy, caste hierarchy. Anyway, so my thesis was all about all of that, but we deviated a little bit because during this period, I went to some wonderful conferences one of them I remember vividly. It was called
Yeah.
the Performadillo
Uh-huh.
in Texas, 1973.
Performadillo.
And Grace, and I actually went with Grace on the aeroplane.
Okay.
Yeah, and I remember talking to him in the airport and so on.
Okay.
So Grace himself was an amazing figure. So you just have to imagine this Oxford Don, that's what he was,
Yes.
a real kind of traditional Oxford philosopher,
Yeah.
transported to California,
Yes.
turned into a hedonistic hippie, with a coterie of admiring graduate students, many of whom female, and it was an extraordinary. And he actually, I do think that what we have of his only is a small portion of his thought, which is a pity, because one of the things he was doing was kind of an imaginative reconstruction, if you like, sort of imaginary robotics. What would it take to make a human from the ground up, in terms of, what kind of cognitive capacities would you have to build in? And so, yeah, he called those pirates, and a seminar would be about pirates, and now what about belief versus knowledge? And
Sure. all
the kind of philosophical notions being explored.
Wow.
Yeah.
But he wasn't. I think sometimes people might think Grace was even your supervisor in your work, because of the extent to which you.
Yes.
He
had only a sort of tangential relationship to him, really.
Okay.
But he was happy to have people sit on his seminars. And in a way, there was so much going on. The the linguistics was absolutely flourishing, because that was a point where, it was beginning. Generative semantics was this sort of breaking away from the Chomskyan Bible, and there was a lot of energy and fierce fights, and so the linguistic wars had just begun in a sense.
Yeah.
And Lakoff was one of the key figures. But Hadros came and went, and many other famous, James Macaulay,
of course, right.
who was also a character. I once went to visit him in Chicago. He, his apartment was completely dominated by a grand piano covered in cats. It was so characters, and John Searle, of course, was a character too. I mean, he drove a Porsche, and on the roof were always his skis, because he could make a quick getaway to have a ski. And and he was. I enjoyed him because, again, from I'd taken a bit of philosophy in Cambridge, and once sat in on Enscombe, for example, and then Searle is a bit like, letting a plumber loose in a philosophy department. He has this kind of, well, let's just simplify this,
Well, we could call him an engineer, right? Engineering.
But it's kind of brute method for...
sure.
One of the amazing things about Searle is that, he never wrote a word. He worked entirely verbally. He dictated his books. He gave these lectures.
Sure.
And then a faithful secretary would type it out.
Yeah.
And then I said, now then you must at least have edited. I would say to him. He said, no, all I would do is put a yellow mark around this bit and then redictate it. Put a number 1.
It's extraordinary.
So, and that's why the books read so well, of course.
Of course, because it's not
turgid
text, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Some tips for younger scholars these days, right?
So it's a real character. But Berkeley, it was a formative period, and through that, and then again, actually, 1973, went to an LSA meeting where I got to know Manny Shegloff and
Okay.
Harvey Sachs. They were
Sure.
lecturing.
Sure.
And
Okay.
Harvey Sachs is, I think those lectures are in the collected lectures, sort of buried there somewhere.
Okay. Yeah.
Manny, many of us know as a person, but Harvey, not many of us still have met him,
Of course,
I think,
yeah.
because he died tragically young. But he was a very charismatic figure.
Okay.
I mean, Manny is very charismatic too, partly just
Sure.
by force of personality and his sort of judicial mind. He's a kind of razor sharp kind of judicial kind of mind. But Harvey was a very creative and he thought on his feet. That's why. So the lectures come across as they do, and so in these lectures, he would pace backwards and forwards, smoking a cheroot, a long thin scarf, and in cowboy boots, going clonk clonk clonk, and then you'd get this flow of thought. There was no notes, or you'd have transcripts, but
but he was just talking through.
Yeah. It was very impressive, really. I mean, and anyway, so there you have, and then back at base there was John Gumpertz, who was again, many of us known and met him, but he, of course, is now long gone. But he was a very congenial, friendly, and special character, actually, because he could. You'd come with a sort of half-baked, silly idea, and he would turn it into something very useful and nice. He was that kind of a person, and I think all of his students feel a deep affection for him, and of course Jenny.
Yes. And so somehow Goffman was in the mix.
Yes, well,
for us,
only because John took a sabbatical. I don't know where he went actually, but Gillian Sankoff came as his replacement, and Irving Goffman was in tow.
Okay.
And so we got to meet him. Another extraordinary character.
Yes, of course.
Fairly formidable. I mean, but he was interested. Penny and I were already thinking about politeness and so on. And he was in. You could talk to him. I remember trying out picnicking with him and Gillian outside Berkeley and trying out some ideas on him about. I called it sequiturnus. What connects one utterance to another, and the unspoken. Assumptions that have to do the glue between utterances, he had very interesting things to say. Needless to say, later when I had just moved to Cambridge with Penny. Back to Cambridge, and I'll come to how that happened. But later we had Goffman visit us there, and this just gives you a sense for what a peculiar character he was. Gillian fell off the back of a bus in London. In those days, they had sort of an open back.
Sure.
And she got a dreadful black eye. I mean, Faith and she was with bandages and nothing like that. Goffman was fascinated because he was followed around looking at what people were looking at, because he was so interested that they would avert their gaze and think, a battered woman, a battered wife, or a what?
Right, all sorts of inferences. Yes.
That was just. He was such an observer of people. He was interested in his own true love becoming an object of attention.
Yes. Okay.
Anyway, sorry, I deviate. Yes, so just to return to sort of chronology of it.
Sure.
I was passing back from India, and I passed through Cambridge, and Eleanor Oakes, then Keenan, married to Ed Keenan, was teaching sociolinguistics in the linguistics department, while Ed had a fellowship at King's College, and Ed was doing the most amazing things. He was really inventing or reinventing typology, putting it on a much more kind of systematic basis, and so Bernard Comrie was there, learning from him. So that's where Bernard sort of picked up some kind of this kind of systematic typology. Had a whole coterie of people, because Ed was such a breath of fresh air into British linguistics at the time.
Sure.
He came wearing his Davy Crockett jacket to King's College High Table. You know, he was he was a character too.
Shaking up, right.
And all these young people following him. Gerald Gazdar, many, Ewan Klein, many others were influenced by him, and learned, you know, in a way, well, sort of to be ambitious about trying to classify and categorize languages and understand their differences and so on. Ed had worked with Eleanor, of course, on Malagasy. So
the famous, the famous work
yes.
there, right?
Yeah. Anyway, so they were now moving back to the States, and Eleanor's job was up. And I didn't really have any interest in a job at that stage. I still hadn't finished my thesis. But anyway, they somehow got persuaded I should just interview what harm was done, you know.
Sure.
So I had to borrow a suit from my brother, and my long hair and totally inappropriate suits. It was sort of almost white, and anyway, go to the interview in front of this sort of row of people in dark robes in those days. It's very formal.
Wow.
It's like going into court. Anyway, but with that hubris that youth has, you know, I was full of, you know, I could be the emissary of, you know, Gracian, Celia, Gompertia, whatever. And so I won them over somehow. And I got this job, which I didn't really want, and I wasn't really ready for.
So at that point you had, how far were you through your PhD?
Well, I'd done the fieldwork,
yes,
at least.
But you read the writing
I hadn't done the write-up, much of it anyway.
Wow.
So a bit sort of reluctance, but on the other hand, you can't, you know, look.
It was an opportunity, right?
So I knuckled down to teaching, and you know, developed my first sort of pragmatics course. Because I did feel like I was an emissary from this Berkeley special thing. I mean, you know, looking back at it, you know, I was, again, with the hubris of youth, imagining that I was the sole conduit for, you know, whereas, of course, Deirdre Wilson had also attended, I think, probably the original William James lectures in Harvard. Was also developing her line.
So your link into the William James was reading transcripts of the lectures then?
And then talking everybody in those days circulated stuff. It was called a sort of grey literature of mimeode. They had these kind of purple mimeos that were sort of reproductive technology, because, you know, the Xerox hadn't been invented, and it's hard to imagine, isn't it? But it was quite labour intensive. You sort of turned a great cranking handle, put ink on things, and this thing would spit out.
I think I've got some image of that. Right?
Anyway, so Harvey Sachs's lectures were circulating in that form, or some of them transcribed by Gale Jefferson, and Grice's lectures by some. This coterie of
graduate students,
and then so this stuff was all circulating around, but there wasn't. Fillmore was, you know, thinking about Deixis.
But much of this was unpublished at that point in time, right?
Yes.
We think about what was actually published.
Very little,
right?
Yeah.
But all these ideas were circulating.
They were circulating, and there was material around.
Yeah.
And who am I leaving out? Well, Berlin and Kay. So they were doing their kind of anti-relativist thing, which, you know, it was interesting. I mean, it was definitely something that kind of, was always at the back of my mind, was always kind of important stuff.
Yes.
And anyway, so there I was in Cambridge, developing a pragmatics course, which, as I said, wrongly I was imagining I was teaching the world.
But it could be, it was the world's first course in pragmatics.
I don't know.
Did anyone else do it?
I don't know. Quite possibly that Deirdre was doing something. In
Okay,
London.
as well.
I don't know. When did she finish the thesis? 73,
Yeah.
I think. Anyway, I'm not entirely sure on the time.
First,
yes, one of the first.
Gosh. So what was in the syllabus of the first course? Or is that
I think my book more or less
Yes.
reflected what I was teaching, because that's how it developed.
Sure, okay.
And I was fortunate, Gerald Gasdar, who I'd met through the Ed Keane connection, he and I started the first Pragmatics journal, which was called Pragmatics Microfiche. This was sort of Gerald being a kind of believer in future technology. That seemed like a very clever future technology, because you could shrink a huge edition into a little thing, which you could then mail out. So we would lick many envelopes, sending these things out around the world. And we published in CA, and we published, early, all sorts of early versions of things that came out. There were, and that ran for just about 3 years, I think, and then the Journal of Pragmatics started up, and a real journal.
So Journal of Pragmatics, and then I guess IPRA was not formed at that time.
No,
there was no
there
Pragmatics journal.
No.
So you just sort of let the series slide.
Yes, we packed it in. And Gerald, meanwhile, having come to the conclusion that there was a way around the sort of transformational arguments of Chomsky, that using context-free phrase structure grammars could do much more than anyone had thought. This was his famous slash categories, which actually still, his insights still drive natural language processing to this day. Yes, the generation of utterances is he's actually a very important figure, and his thesis was on sort of formal pragmatics, pushing so, and that was done with Hans Kamp, who was in London at the time, and was also kind of very influential figure.
Yes, absolutely. Wow.
So, those early years in Cambridge were fun. Yes. And then we were developing, Penny and I, we were developing these politeness things.
So we have to reverse a bit.
Yes.
Okay, you started developing these politeness things, but
so
you're an anthropologist, all of these ideas. What led you to universal politeness theory?
Well, I suppose we were influenced by Berlin and Kay, probably. But being interested in the fine texture of interaction, that's what we were both, our theses were both about.
Yes.
But in different societies, and yet discerning strange parallels, and thinking, wait a minute, there's something going on here, right?
Yes,
and then by putting it together with the sort of Brown and Gilman ideas about power and solidarity, we came up with this kind of whole structure of ideas about what politeness is, and Goffman, of course, we borrowed stuff from, and further back from Durkheim and so on. So we made this concoction.
Yes.
And this might not have gone anywhere, except that in 1974, I think it was, Peter Drucker was running a big sociolinguistics conference in London, so we submitted an abstract, accepted, and so we went and gave it a talk. And Peter Trudgill tore us to shreds. It was a public humiliation, a denunciation. This is not sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistics is Labov, essentially.
Okay. Wow.
And our reaction to that was, very well, we'll take you on, as it were, and we wrote it up, seriously as a book.
Yes.
But I owe him a debt of gratitude. I've often told him that, because without that push, we wouldn't have been so outraged that gave us the energy.
Yes, just to say, well, we'll learn you, right?
So. Yes, that's how it came about, really. And then and then again, in the way that things did in those days, we circulated it in Mimeo around the world. And Robin Lakeworth, meanwhile, had done a short article only, I think, if I recollect right. At that stage, and then, but it was. It was sort of clearly ripe, the ideas, but it didn't actually get published until Esther Goody, who anthropologist in Cambridge, who was she's American, daughter of a famous American sociologist who was interested in interaction, so she had this kind of actual interest in interaction, which was completely alien to British anthropology. British anthropologists somehow. They were either interested in the sort of structuralist ideas and had gone down that direction, or they were interested in the sort of ideas of society as a kind of jural framework of rights, duties, and obligations, and so on, and and how that held the whole thing together. And in actual interaction with one or two, there were some exceptions, but it was on the margins, and Esther was one of the proponents.
Wow.
Anyway, so she published this little book.
And I've always been curious about that book because your chapter is
it was sort of most of it.
Most of the book. So how did that all? I'm just curious.
I think
the publisher CEP were happy with this, right?
Reviews must have been very positive, and her introduction was very good, I think. And then her paper on questions was thoughtful and interesting. Still actually worth reading. Anyone who's interested in questions. So we were her proteges. I mean, she pushed us, and I was very helpful. We owe a debt of gratitude to her.
Things done.
Her husband at the time was Jack Goody, who is you probably know him probably through literacy and the effect but he was one of the first people to do sort of very grand theory on sort of what makes Eurasia different than Africa, and of which literacy is one of the factors that made it possible to have huge empires and keep track of them and have a deep history and all those kind of things. So a very interesting figure too. Anyway, he was around. So
And so we should probably just pull the politeness thread to its end.
It
got reissued as the 1987 book. Go back to
so they sold enough copies on the basis of the earlier version that they realised, this could this was going
something important.
Yes, and so then in the early 80s, so we're just going chronologically for the moment. We got the chance to go to Australia, and we went to Roger Keesing was putting together. He had the kind of idea he had of instead of making permanent employees in his department, to just hire a lot of interesting people for a short period, like 1 or 2 years. And so we got essentially glorious postdocs at ANU in the Research School of Pacific Studies.
Which is still there, right?
You're still there. Nick Evans for years has dominated. So Roger was a linguistic anthropologist. Wow. Interesting guy, actually. Very great tennis player. Died on the tennis court, so he died early.
One way to go, right?
But quite a character too. But
extraordinary, right? To be able to have that false personality to get something like that happen.
Yes. So we had very interesting people. Michael Silstein came.
Oh gosh. Okay.
Van Valen was there. Eleanor Oakes, Sandra Duranti, myself. Mike Mormon.
Wow.
I'm forgetting people now, but it was glorious 2 years. I mean, I had to. Unfortunately, I could only get leave for 1 year. So
because of your position.
I had a sabbatical.
Yes.
So I could use one sabbatical, but then I commuted for the
Okay.
for the other year.
Oh gosh, that
Which
must
was,
have been
I mean,
fun.
those days was
right?
quite extraordinary.
Yes.
But we chose to, while we were in Australia, we thought, oh, well, let's do fieldwork. We're fieldwork people.
Okay, sure.
So we got a little grant from IATSIS, as it then was, the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Institute, and
Sure.
popped up to northern Queensland to a group of Aboriginals who speak a language called Gugu Yimitjer. And that was, for me, a tremendously extraordinary experience. I think the thing is that, so we had worked in peasant societies before that.
Sure.
And there is something very regimented about peasant societies. People, and it's remarked upon in the literature, sort of the privacy notions and the kind of don't want your neighbours to know how much money you've got and all that kind of thing. It's very sort of peasant and these small scale, agriculture and commerce and so on. And then to be amongst a group of people who organised on completely different lines, and who were such individuals. I think never met such a society of such characters. Yes. They were. You think about academics as being extraordinary people, but Aboriginal people. For example, there was Tulo Gordon, a poet and a mystic, and occasionally a drunkard, but a delightful person, really interesting. And then I worked a lot with a guy called Roger Hart, who was a very serious, much more serious, responsible, and a person very good to work with. Sure, a delightful person too. But who, you just got this sort of feeling of the extraordinary, downtrodden, exploited character. His life had been, he'd almost been like an indentured labourer on the Queensland gold cane fields. Terribly hard work. But general sort of lack of real resentment to white fellas, which I thought was also very interesting.
So how long did you spend up in
Not that long. It was the summer, and then
in the summertime.
It was our northern summer.
Oh, okay.
Sorry,
okay.
Yes,
Winter,
yes,
right.
yes,
Yeah,
winter. It was very nice. Yeah,
it would be nice that time.
And we had our kid was born in Canberra, and then he came up with he came up played with the Aboriginal kids who were quite tough, but no, it was extremely interesting, and our job was to try to explore something about a little bit like Diana Eads was doing at the time, Aboriginal white fella interaction. And so we did do quite a lot of recordings we did sort of doctor-patient interviews and things that were fascinating. I mean, they were also heart-rending. I mean, the extent of the miscommunications, There were sort of things like the doctor would say, well, you take these pills in the morning, these pills in the evening, and the poor patient would say, because these were emphatics or something, and under the Google image of gesture conventions, if you point, you mean precisely there, and in a geocentric fixed direction, and there were all of these miscommunications between these sort of two systems that are just completely fascinating, actually. And ideally published something on this, and then it was actually I submitted something to Peter Auer. Then didn't fit in his. There was some mismatch between PCs and Macs, and it never got published.
So to this day?
To this day,
it's unpublished.
Unpublished. But in a way, it was difficult to publish because we had too much confidential information, but it was anyway. But I did take the opportunity to learn a bit of Google Images,
Okay.
and to study it a bit.
Yes,
And John Haviland had been working on it extensively,
Okay.
so and he had given us introductions to people, and so
Right.
it made it basically made it all easy to kind of filter in, as it were.
Yeah.
Anyway, so but I did collect quite a lot of Google Image stories and just conversation and so on, and we had early U-matic heavy grade video cameras, and that would run for like 20 minutes before their batteries were. But so we had that kind of stuff.
So have you kept your
yes,
data, right?
It's all it's archived both in IATSIS and in Max Planck. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. That's extraordinary. Because that would be quite rare.
Yes,
Recordings of conversation.
Yes,
that's not what
yes,
linguists normally do, right?
No.
Yes.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, some of it transcribed.
Sure.
John Haviland found fault with some of my transcriptions, probably rightly. But anyway, I did my best. But anyway, on the basis of that, I then began to think about the application of pragmatic theory and Gricean kind of implications to sort of grammar, and how and in particular I started thinking that Chomsky's government and binding things, which were being developed at the time, could partly be reduced to pragmatic phenomena.
Okay.
So I actually got to meet Chomsky in Cambridge. He came to give some lectures. Of course, he had to talk on politics as well as. And I was introduced by a kindly colleague, Terry Moore, to him, and I tried to explain to Chomsky how I didn't really think that Google Images fitted his generalization.
Yeah, sure.
And I rapidly realized Chomsky is not a listener. He's not really interested in little facts that don't fit.
And there's one way to theorize, right?
Which is, yes. And of course, he had a lot of people coming up with a lot of things that didn't fit, so I could understand it was just another little wrinkle that they didn't really want to attend to.
Yes,
but I did feel, I could understand that you're talking to a bit of a brick wall there. But
so this is all quite formative too, because
yes.
I can see can start to see the flow on from this experience, right, in terms of a lot of the work you've done.
Yeah.
Right.
So then I did publish that stuff.
A
couple of papers that did cause a certain amount of wrinkle and furore, as it were, in the sort of syntax, the generative world.
Yes, yeah.
But I think. And actually then Yan Wang, who was an early student of mine at Cambridge, straight from the fields where his family had been relegated by Mao, because he came from an intellectual family, and dreadful stories about living in the fields in the mud hut. Or a cave. Anyway, there he came, but he was so bright and so serious. He was fantastic. But anyway, he went on to develop these ideas much more sort of.
Yes, of course, right. Yes,
fully than I ever was able to.
Yes,
yeah.
So can we wind back? Because
you
did mention you developed, we'll say, one of the world's first courses in pragmatics, right?
Yeah.
And then I guess that's quite natural. It was like the Cambridge Lectures in Pragmatics, right? Which was the very famous 1983 textbook.
Yes.
So I guess you said that was your syllabus?
More or less.
More or less.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
So there's a sort of natural progression.
Yeah.
I have to ask, why did you put the CA chapter in there?
Because interesting. Because I got quite a bit of flack for it actually from the sort of the pucker linguists who thought it didn't belong.
Sure.
So John Lyons was the editor of my
of the book series, right?
And he was. I mean, I persuaded him that it was sensible, but I remember Peter Matthews didn't think it belonged, and I think that I don't entirely know why there was this resistance,
Yes,
but you know, I think it's partly the way those early CA papers were written, in a very peculiar, almost Germanic dialect. They were, I remember, you know, already the title, The Simpler Systematics, kind of
yes, yeah.
raised hackles, and anyway, so I, as I said, I had kind of attended the Saxe-Shegloff
yes,
thing,
so obviously
and
hugely
Gumpert
influential.
fused all of this together with the implicatures
right.
and sequential structures, and
Yes,
you know,
yes.
he was interested in all of this because he was already beginning to work on miscommunication, and he was interested in all of it.
Yes,
So it seemed to me an absolutely natural fit. Also, actually, to his credit, Gerald Gastar, those years ago when we were doing Pragmatics microfiche, you know, he insisted on including that in our early versions of our first journal.
Okay. Yes.
So, no, and we went to CA, early CA meetings in the UK. Yeah.
Okay. So the CA group in the UK was, I'm just trying to think of who that would have been at that time.
Well, Atkinson, Drew, Button.
Of course.
There was a guy called Graham Button. And I forget them
John
all.
Arley.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
John Heritage must have been somewhere.
Yes, he was. That's right. He was that. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it was quite vibrant, actually, the CA sort of folks, and there was also an ethno-methodology side. Yeah, and I should say at Cambridge there was this guy called Brian Butterworth, who was a psychologist still around, and still I heard that he was just giving some lectures somewhere. He's a psychologist, a real, you know, papa processing psychologist, but he was interested in all of this. Thinking about language production, what do you have to know in order to produce the utterance on time and in the right place?
Yes.
He came from a school of psychologists that were interested in pauses as a sign of, you know, mental processing and something. He was so there was actually, it was quite a good environment in a way.
Absolutely.
But not good enough that when the Max Planck came exploring, that I didn't at least entertain.
So when did you move to Max Planck?
So, well, it started like this. In 1986, I know that I remember it because this was the year of Chernobyl, we were invited, myself, I think John Haviland, and one or two other people, a guy called Johannes Fabian, and so a few anthropologists and a few psychologists who were invited to the Max Planck Castle, which is in Germany, in the Alps, overlooking a lake.
They have their own castle.
They have their own, naturally, of course, you know. Doesn't the University of Queensland have a castle? It's a kitsch castle, by the way, but anyway. But anyway, it's a fun sort of conference centre, really. Okay. So I went there, and they were looking to form a unit that would do, and the working title was Cognitive Anthropology, and they wanted to fuse anthropology with psychology, just sort of look at the intersection.
Sure.
And it was the Max Planck's a very interesting organisation. It has these people. I mean, it's a sort of sport, starting new institutes, the sport of kings, I would say. You know, to forge new developments, and the Max Planck, by virtue of the fact that it closes institutes down every now and then, has the resources to start another one up. So they were looking around to for a theme, and they'd come on to this
cognition,
and this idea of putting cognition in
psychology.
Anyway, they didn't have in mind me. They thought I would be maybe useful for this meeting. They had in mind another, this guy called Johannes Fabian, who was a Dutch anthropologist.
Okay.
And they had a couple of German psychologists in mind. anyway, this Dutch psychologist did a sort of postmodernist suicide on the event. I mean, because it was very clear that there was no way he could work with a psychologist.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So then,
so they're left wondering, oh gosh, what are we going to do?
Yes, and I
here,
had
right?
hardly taken this. I hadn't done very much preparation for this. I was meant to do a little talk. So then Jack Goody was on this committee. He Jack Goody, the fingers of influence. A very influential guy, actually. And he had, so he probably was responsible for me being there, now I think of it.
Sure.
And I said to him, well, I'm not seriously, I've got a nice job at Cambridge, why would I possibly be interested in this? He said, young man, live dangerously. I always did, he said, which was true. Yeah. Went from untenured position to untenured position for quite a while. And it was good advice, I have to say,
Yes,
and
right.
I do give it to young people.
So Max Planck, you were going in as a fixed, it wasn't a tenure?
It wasn't a tenure position.
From Cambridge,
Yes,
right,
yes,
okay,
yes.
wow.
But I did actually take a slight precaution of taking leave from Cambridge,
Sure.
so it would have lasted a little bit.
Yes,
And anyway, but I remember this, and then him having said this to me, I thought, oh my God, I better get her to talk together,
Right.
and then everybody else was going off boating on the lake by the castle, and so I had to sort of quickly scribble something down and get her to talk together.
Sure.
Anyway, and then afterwards, Jack Goody said to me, "You swat." You didn't come with us. Anyway.
So what was the talk you prepared?
It was about Google Imager and and how and about
wow.
sort of absolute reckoning and thinking and how mind-blowing that was really.
Yes,
in the context of how we think. And
Okay.
anyway, so this went down so well that they ended up offering me this opportunity, which was to start a kind of just an untenured group, but if it worked well, then they were going to tenure it. It was turn it into a whole full-fledged institute.
Sure.
It was meant to be in Berlin, so off precept for Berlin. We hadn't been there more than a few months when the wall came down. So this is 89, October 89, the wall came down.
Right.
And of course that was very exciting.
To be there at that
just
time.
to be there, watch the flow of Poles. They would come in with ramshackle larders and other vehicles and then load them up with oranges and bananas. They were so starved of these convoys of bananas that would head back to the east. Anyway, but it was very, very interesting.
Wow.
But it did somewhat pull the rug from out of this institute to be, because it was meant to be funded by the city of Berlin, partly,
Yes.
and partly by the Max Planck Society, and suddenly the city of Berlin had to reunite railways, and and it was just like that was not interesting to them anymore, and they couldn't, and then they never actually found us an appropriate building, and now suddenly. We're going to be ministries and other things. There was no room for another.
Of course, right. Yes. So this is then the shift to Nijmegen.
That was a shift to Nijmegen. Yeah. And that was made possible just by the interest of Wolfgang Klein and Pim Leyfeld, the founding directors in Nijmegen.
Okay. Yeah.
Wolfgang Klein. Because he was a linguist and he wanted more linguists.
Sure.
I had given the Nijmegen lectures, as it were, in Nijmegen the year before, and so that had gone down very well, and people liked that was again sort of pragmatics.
Sure.
And Pim Leyfeld, who is extraordinary character to this day, a very lucid thinker, and combining, real sort of narrow lines of research, where at any one moment it would be looking for little needles, in some haystack, as it were.
Sure.
Very kind of scientific, almost psychophysical type research, combined with a very broad interest in every aspect of language. He's an amazing character. So he was welcoming, and he had, I think they had wanted cross-linguistic work done in the Institute, on exotic languages, as it were.
Sure.
And Suzanne Romain had been there, Jack Hawkins, I think Eleanor Oates too on a visiting position. I'm not sure about that now. Yeah. But in any case, they were interested in that aspect too. So they said, fine. We lost one director. That was Marsden Wilson, the British psycholinguist who went back to Cambridge, as it happened, and so we did a movable chairs thing, and so I went to Nijmegen, and I have to say, it was a very easy place to. Germany is actually quite, it's more of a learning curve for a foreigner. The Netherlands is very easy. They make life very easy for one, and. It was a very nice place to bring up a kid and so on. So that was nice, and then we had the opportunity then to do a little unit on cognitive anthropology, not the same scale as it would have been in Berlin.
Yes. Yeah.
But
so how big was it at that point in time?
Well, it was quite small staff. It was like 5 staff, and but then money for postdocs and visitors and graduates, and so then you'd easily get up to 20.
Yeah. Okay.
And
that's pretty substantial.
And then we had my sort of solution was how to get a kind of name for this thing, how to get it off the ground, how to get a sort of brand recognition, as it were.
Right. Yeah.
And so I just imported as visitors all sorts of interesting people, including John Haviland, Lourdes de Leon, the Lucys, Susan Gaskins, John Lucy, many other very interesting people, Jorg Wassmann, who was a Swiss anthropologist specialist in New Guinea, and so we managed to sort of, because of the combined weight of all of these people, we could attract good graduate students, and so so it became very interesting. I think it was an interesting environment, and it was exciting because we were just trying to see, space was one of the main themes, not the only one, but but it was the predominant theme early on, and it really did sort of. It was easy to collect data.
Sure.
You could have a little stimuli, and then early on, I went back to Google Imager Land, found my old friends, and got them to do various tasks, which they couldn't have done straight off, because we had this relationship from before. I was able to sort of work with them and make them do things that a little bit artificial, but we would sort of turn people around and get them to point to things, and we were very interested in the fact that it was such a simple manipulation, but I sort of had to brainstorm this manipulation. I remember sitting there thinking, how are we going to get at this? How can I actually show that they think differently? It's one thing to know that they point somewhere when they mean somewhere, but how do you actually get? How do you show that that's somehow deep inside? And so then I just had this little brainwave of that if you made somebody make an array, they see an array on a table, and you just rotate them 180 degrees, so they turn the other way around, and now you ask them to make the array again. Then, if they have transposed this, holding all of the thing in absolute coordinates, north, south, east, west, it'll be sort of back the front from our point of view.
Yes, right.
From a left-right point of view, but correctly oriented from their point of view.
Sure.
And this worked like a dream.
Very clear. Very clear.
And then so that was a paradigm that we then explored, and I had got various help on sort of making that more systematic and refined, but. And people then have run that all over the world, that kind of thing. And we had a little, kit that we then could go on to develop with experiments and tasks and things you can ask people. And those things are still online, actually, for the most part.
So this is kind of one of the themes, I think, across a lot of your work, which is cultural relativity.
Yes,
universalism.
Yes. And the play between them.
The play between them,
Yes, indeed. I think that is really one of the things that really interests me is that on the one hand you have this kind of kaleidoscope of cultures and the sort of fractal details like you find in India, all of this elaboration of ritual and you've got extraordinary cultural superstructure.
Yes.
And yet somehow we have access, at least partially. We can sort of work our way into these systems.
Sure.
And we can only do that, presumably, because there is some kind of common core that makes it possible.
Yes.
And in a way, I think that that common core, so a bit like, in the case of sort of politeness, the feeling that underneath this surface variety, actually there are some common themes.
Yes, right.
And there's a real sort of structure in here.
Yes.
But it takes a little bit of unearthing. So then I kind of went on to sort of develop this idea that, and gradually come to this conclusion that I have to say that perhaps I've been all along, if you compare sort of Dan Everett or whatever, I've been relatively sort of hesitant and careful, about sort of going out there and saying, hey, you guys are all wrong, kind of thing. But I like to sort of have the evidence and move slowly and convince myself, but I have come to sort of conclusion, and this was when I wrote this paper with Nick Evans on...
Of course, right, yes.
What do we call it?
Well, it's sequential universals, interactional universals over language universals, right?
Yes. That actually that the universals lie at a deeper level. They're in deeper infrastructure than the sort of Chomskyan take.
Yes.
That it's not really at that level of a coding system and so on, but more at the level of how whatever it is that allows you to build these systems, and then the variety itself is handled by cultural evolution. It's so I think that's how we got into that, so space is one of these things where the system. You do need some way to calibrate spatial description, obviously, but there are different solutions, and they're all equally good. But
some
are
more
and they're good and good for different purposes, of course.
Sure.
So
there's it's interesting in Australia. I mean, unless you've been there, you don't realise just. Well, it depends, not North Queensland, but if you go out west, it's just flat and featureless.
Featureless,
You're going to have to find other ways, because left and right is not going to
help you very far. No. Yeah. So, and then through the offices of Gunter Senft, I started to work in New Guinea. I mean, when I was actually working in Gugi Yimmijaland, I popped across to New Guinea. It's a short hop, really, and visited.
Just on a ferry.
It was a plane.
Oh, a plane.
To the Trobrians, where Gunter was working, and the contrast between what he could do. And this sort of vibrant tribal society, and these rather, I suppose, partly dysfunctional Aboriginal groups that laboured under all sorts of difficulties in those days. And I was sort of thinking, wow, maybe I want to work in one of those vibrant tribal societies.
Sure, of course, in Papua New Guinea there's just
and there are
incredible
take your pick from 800 or 900, And I actually had planned to go in a particular place in one of the provinces called Milne Bay, which is a little bit less dangerous actually than others.
Okay, sure.
And less, well, at least less known for tribal warfare is how the right way to put it.
Okay.
And anyway, I went with sort of, hobnail boots and a backpack because I was planning to sort of walk up into the mountains and sort of find my way amongst dugout peoples up there. So, in sort of mountains beyond. Anyway, away from the provincial capital. But then I heard that this boat was going out to Russell Islands, and I knew that it was a very weird language. Enough had been published, not published actually, but it was available through SIL.
Okay.
That by the SIL linguists, Henderson's by name, who were actually very superior SIL folks in the sense that they were very careful and I came to kind of respect their work very much. But at that time he hadn't published anything major. But anyway, I stopped on this boat, and I was so welcomed by them. The Russell Islanders are, like a lot of very vibrant, fun-loving people, but like a lot of the Melanesians, but they also have this real thing that they really think they're special. Everybody tells them they're special. Nobody else can learn their language. Because it's got this reputation for being unlearnable.
Okay.
It is indeed an isolate, unconnected to anything else. As far as we can tell, there's no sort of historical connection to anything. It's the people themselves look a little bit different than anybody else in the area, and anyway, they have this correctly, I think, very self-confident. So again, unlike these sort of ethnic minorities in downtrodden peasants and so on that I had worked with earlier, they were a delight to work with and very welcoming, and would let me do record anything and everything, and so the language is very difficult. And
so have you managed to speak?
Haltingly, I can make myself understood, but I would not. I came too late, honestly, in my 40s, late 40s to kind of really speak it well, but well enough, and transcribing, I can transcribe it and so on, It was just so mind-blowing for me again. It was just, I think for me, actually, this is what fieldwork does. That's why it's like if you're kind of out of ideas, just do some fieldwork. You're bound to hit serendipity. Will throw up. You think, oh, how does that work? How can a language possibly work like that? And So I was just doing sort of comparative work. We would trot around the world, each of us in the group, collecting data so that we could match it and compare it. So we were doing this kind of comparative semantic typology, really, is what we were doing. And so I was doing my bit for many years, trotting out there. It's a 5-day trip out you have to hire a trawler, no other way to get there. And hope he'll come back for you. Right.
Eventually.
Yes. So that's one reason why those kind of parts of the world are underexplored, because it's expensive and difficult to get there. I've had malaria 3 times. It's not without its dangers too. But I think the main dangers are the transport. We've run out of fuel in this boat in the middle of the ocean. It's kind of interesting.
Did it happen to you?
Yes.
Getting stuck in the middle?
We've had a lot of these.
Escapes or
we sprung a hole in the deep bottom of the boat with a fountain at the middle, and to run the boat out on the shore onto a sandbank.
Incredible.
So yes, there are many adventures, but I think that what I really do advise linguists to do fieldwork, because I think for this reason it sort of opens their eyes to, and the more different, the less connected to your culture, the better, because
it's going to shake you up.
Shake you
right.
up. Yeah.
Yes. So what did Russell? I mean, you talked about the next sort of tranche of work. What did going to the Russell Island do for your work? Do you think intellectually?
Good question. Well, I think that I got back into grammar. I wrote a grammar of Yeltsin, which is freely downloadable.
Sure.
I advertise that because you
yes.
get it off my website or Mouton de Gruyter's website.
Sure.
It's just the kind of language that would shock a linguist. You know, it's got sounds that are not known from any other language. It's got a different kind of syntactic ergativity, not the kind that I'd previously recognized to exist. It's got extraordinary properties of all kinds, actually. Like negation is sort of extraordinarily indirectly expressed in many, many different ways. I think it's just, I just enjoy working on it. And we got a lot of conversational data. I've got about 600 hours of videotape. We did eye tracking experiments.
So how much have you published from the sort of conversational and then your eye tracking?
Just papers here and there, on whatever it is.
Yes, you were working on
at
the time, I
that's
suppose,
right.
Yeah.
So you'll see that they keep popping up in my oeuvre.
Yes.
Yeah, Russell data. Yeah.
So are the linguists taking notice? Do you think?
I don't know. It's only just come out, really. It's only been out a few months, I suppose. The grammar.
So this is the book you were talking about in Iker in Loughborough. Remember you said you were going to finish a book?
Oh, well, I've also written a book on interaction, which I haven't. I've just got the reviews, but I haven't. So I've got some work to do still.
That's the other book, right.
So probably I was talking about that. So this was a labor of love. It's my kind of a gravestone, in the sense that I think that it'll survive whatever else I do, but everything else will get forgotten. But
But
there's this one thing. That'll be. It'll be a monument.
Indeed, yes.
And no, I think it will linguists. It'll be picked up just by typologists and so on. It's already figured in our giant. This is one of the outcomes of my last years in Nijmegen. We did with Russell Gray in the other institute, Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. Now in Leipzig, we decided to try to get the linguist house in order. So with Nick Evans' help and lots of other scholars around the world, well, we just thought, it's ridiculous. If linguists are going to talk in a sensible way to archaeologists, geneticists, and other people, we've got to have organized databases. So one of the critical things is to get linguistic databases, and the more easier things to do are grammatical databases. So we went for grammatical databases. The phonology ones exist, but we have just, I think it's like 2 weeks ago or so, put out this huge database called GramBank, which is a huge database of about a third of the world's languages, syntactic structures. And it's open access, and it will lead to endless spin-offs. Things you can now ask. Does structure, evolve faster than vocabulary really does? To what extent is structure actually, follow kind of Greenbergian or Chomskyan universal? And to what extent does it not? This is now all you can do your fancy stats on
Yes.
Right. 2,500 languages. So
Wow.
so that actually, I mean, waltz was the first step in that direction, but it's if you think about it as a sort of features on one side and languages down here,
Yes,
the matrix is relatively underpopulated.
Yes,
whereas ours is kind of a fully populated matrix of these two.
So does this mean we have a new, I mean, computational linguistics is its thing, right?
Yes.
But this is like a, I don't know, a computational syntax, or it's going to seed a different type of research that hasn't been possible.
I think that's right, exactly. Yeah. And I think it does make us a proper player with archaeology, genetics, and so on. If you're interested in, trying to trace human population movements and so on, there's another way to do it now.
To do this right.
Yeah. And so I think that's So. So we skipped. I realised, just to pop back a little bit, that 1987 was an important year for me.
Okay.
I taught a course with Larry Haugh in Stanford on pragmatics.
Okay.
So we had a pragmatics course. It was largely implicature.
Okay.
He prefigured his natural history of negation. I prefigured my Google Imager papers and so on. And we had some very interesting students, and it was very nice. And then I had a sabbatical year in Stanford. I worked with Ivan Saug, tragically died. We were thinking of writing things together, but out of that came my Presumptive Meanings book, which was my attempt to try to put together, where we were now on kind of implicature and
so on.
So that was also a kind of important milestone for me.
But it took so from 1987, but the book itself was published.
Yes, and the reason for that was because I had been, my attention had been taken away by this cognitive anthropology, the founding of the cognitive anthropology.
Right, at the same time.
And so, so that derailed that book for a long while, but I did eventually get it out.
So that leads to a natural question, perhaps from my perspective.
Yes.
So we have a theory of generalized conversational implicature. Is it possible to have a theory of particularized implicatures?
Well, I think that in a sense,
go about it, right?
that is what relevance theory is, really.
Yes, okay.
I think whether it's adequate, I do not. I myself, I wrote a review of an early version of it, explaining my reservations. I mean, at that stage anyway, they've actually slightly changed their tune, but at that stage at least, they very much were thinking about it all as built on just standard logical entailment. You just kind of reason in a deductive way about, and I just don't think that's how we can possibly come up with the meanings that we attribute, which seem like so distant from what is said sometimes.
Right.
And I think that there are much more creative processes involved, and together with there's another part of the story I missed was my relationship to the philosopher J. Atlas.
Of course.
But both he and I, think it's much more difficult than that. And I met him actually in about 1973 at some conference. I think it was that Performadillo conference in Texas. And then we worked together at that LSA of 73, where I got a fellowship to work with him on implicature, actually, on trying to do a kind of formal model of implicature, from which we just began to think about abduction as and the sort of the inference as as it has been called by Goodman, Nelson Goodman, the philosopher, it's sort of inference to the best explanation. How does one leapfrog from, you've got just like a scientist, he sees all these things and he thinks, oh, the explanation for all of this is, but how do we do that jump? And that's kind of creative jump that I think is involved in understanding every utterance.
Right.
I don't really think it's a matter of cranking through a kind of calculus of the kind that I think Deirdre Wilson thinks it is.
Sure. So do you see affinities with, it's the CA mantra, why that now? Which is really directing the analyst to abductive reasoning, right?
Yes. Well, I think that's what my recent lecture there, and my recent keynote at this conference was just sort of pointing out that the speed of human inference here, and together combined with this kind of complexity and abstruseness. It's really a wonderful puzzle. How we do it. How we can do it so fast and apparently flawlessly. Mostly.
Sure.
Of course, there's probably quite a bit of slippage that we don't know about. But it's apparently,
but sort of good enough,
isn't it?
To
extraordinary,
get on.
Actually, really. So it pretty much brings us up to date. I think that.
Perhaps there's one last thing. It's a thread through your work, which we didn't talk about earlier. It's a chapter in the Pragmatics textbook and other books, other articles where you, I guess, take a fairly critical stance on speech act theory as it was developed in the 70s. And then perhaps if we fast forward, there's signposts along the way. But I guess, to my mind, it's that chapter on action ascription and then the subsequent one.
You now have a new book on the subject.
So action, formation, ascription, which is another way of talking about speech acts.
Yes. I think that's how I have to translate it to linguists.
Yes. We're still talking about speech acts.
That's right.
We sometimes have labels.
We reassure them that it's still on for terra firma, although we're not.
Right. So, to my mind, it's more like you've set out a direction in which to go and saying this is unfinished business in pragmatics, which is kind of
because all of the CA sort of reasoning about sequence and so on is built on these shaky foundations because you and after a this or that, but how do we know it's a this? So these are the sort of wobbly foundations of CA, if you like. It's a mystery, actually, I think, of a top first order. And as I say, I suspect that we are talking about sort of abduction of this kind of creative kind to the most, like, what on earth would Michael be thinking that, I might want or whatever, and then I leap to and of course what Mark Dingermanser in the first plenary at this conference was pointing out, well, of course, if I get it wrong, you have the chance to tell me.
We have a systematic system, we have a repair procedures and methods.
So that's, of course, also this, a bit like the game of 20 questions works, where I can get through 20 questions, whatever it is that you're thinking about. We can sort of narrow down through these kind of mechanisms. We can get there. But it is still a miracle how fast and, as I say, apparently flawlessly the whole thing works. And I think the psycholinguists, obviously, what they can show you is, what's happening where in the brain and now in great detail. And they can make kind of models of it all. But I think it's still just hard. You can sort of take these kind of models and you can think, well, actually, it can't quite work like that. It's got to. There've got to be ways of shortcutting these processes.
Otherwise, we'd just
yes. And what are they? I have no idea really. But
but this is the dark matter. Right?
Yes.
The dark matter of pragmatics and so on. And so at this conference, you've given a wonderful presidential address, which kind of, I guess, a tour de force of where we've come, and of course, how much
Yes.
there is to do at
Yes.
pragmatics,
Yes,
and
yes.
how important it is for other disciplines.
Yes,
to know
that's
what's
one
going
thing.
on.
That's one thing I really had hoped to kind of
Yes.
communicate, is that I feel that I think I said we are something like the custodians of critical information
Yes.
that other disciplines really need.
Yes.
And things like, the medical sciences, when they're using diagnostics for autism, or
Sure.
they now have a new label of pragmatic disorder.
Yes.
Well, surely
But
they could come to us and ask for our help, and many other disciplines.
Yes,
And of course, John Gumpert's also had this kind of idea that
Sure.
we have
Sure.
the keys to helping people avoid misunderstandings and so on.
Yes.
So I think there are all sorts of ways in which we really ought to be much more involved in the world. So we're going to look forward to pragmatics in action.
Pragmatics
at
in action in 2025. Perhaps we can talk again and
Yes.
see. But I have to finish one question.
Yes.
Which is, in your presidential address, you said you have a sheep farm.
Yes. Well,
And perhaps the question in everyone's mind is, why do you have a sheep farm?
Well, my parents bought this place years ago. Now, why would they have, doctors in London?
Right.
What on earth were they doing buying a sheep farm in Wales? Well, the thing is, every Australian of that era had a shack in the mountains or in
Just a bolt hole.
a bolt hole.
Right.
I mean, even today, my Canberra colleagues, they have their cabins on the coast, right?
Sure.
And no doubt you do somewhere. And so this was sort of their equivalent. They didn't think, and in fact, my dad, the first shower there was a bush shower. One of those things where you haul up a bucket which has holes in the bottom.
Okay.
You pour in some hot water and pull up this bucket and
Try to get the right temperature and hope for the best.
Which in the colder way, practical. But so that was just his sort of translation of it, of the idea of a bolt hole. Wow. And in those days, it was actually quite remote and quite peasanty, Wales.
Yeah, sure. It would have taken a while to get there.
Yes, 5.5 hours, I think, was a drive from London. Now I can do it in 3 hours from Cambridge, so it's...
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you go out there often?
Yes, every sort of... I'm there, for about 2 weeks in the month, actually, at the moment, anyway.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah, so... actually, though, the stock are not mine.
Okay, you had, of course you'd have someone running stock on the land, right?
That's it, basically. So, my obligation is basically to keep the fields free of weeds, which is actually quite fighting these weeds is a whole another story. I mean, the bracken is this dreadful fern that takes over. It's got just rhizomes that and very hard to defeat. Yes. So, I've got a tractor and cutters and sprayers and I'm out there fixing fences with and cutting out trees that are always falling down on the fences.
It sounds like you've got a bit of Australianness in you.
Yes, I
you didn't really grow up there,
right? Yes. I had an Australian uncle who taught me how to shear a sheep, for example.
So you can shear a sheep. These are the talents we never knew about. Incredible. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been such a pleasure to talk.
Well, it's nice, particularly, I think, to remember these founding characters with their. I mean, they were, as I hope I've conveyed, interesting people.
Forces of nature, and you among them.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.